morning in Alam Nagar started like any other, calm, slow, and bathed in the soft golden light of a winter sun. The town itself was small, nestled among rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Rows of modest houses lined the narrow streets, their rooftops covered in a thin layer of dew. The air carried the faint aroma of wet earth, mingled with the smell of fresh parathas frying in kitchens across the neighborhood. Mona's house sat at the edge of the town, right where the asphalt roads gave way to dirt paths leading into the woods. It wasn't a big house, just 2 stories with faded yellow walls and a creaky wooden door. But it was cozy, filled with the warmth of family chatter and the occasional bark of their dog, Rinku. Mona, 22 years old and perpetually curious, had lived there all her life. She loved the house, but more than that, she loved the woods that stretched behind it. To her, they felt like a world of their own, full of secrets waiting to be discovered. The day began like it always did for Mona. She woke up to the sound of her alarm, an old digital clock with a shrill beep she had meant to replace for years, and the faint chatter of her younger brother Rehan, already awake and animatedly talking to someone on his phone. Pulling on a worn hoodie and a pair of fuzzy socks, she made her way downstairs to find her mother standing at the kitchen counter, expertly flipping parathas on a hot griddle. The kitchen smelled of butter and spices, and the faint sound of an old Hindi song played from the tiny radio perched on the windowsill. "Late again," her mother teased, handing her a steaming plate of breakfast. Mona grinned, taking the plate and sitting by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was slowly coming to life. The milkman cycled past their gate, ringing his bell to announce his arrival. Across the street, Mrs. Sharma was busy watering her plants, her sari trailing behind her as she hummed softly to herself. It was all so familiar, so wonderfully mundane. By mid-morning, Mona had retreated to her room, her safe haven filled with books, scattered sketch bits, and a desk cluttered with everything from half-empty coffee mugs to a stack of old postcards. Her laptop sat open on the desk, the screen glowing softly as she scrolled through Telegram. Mona wasn't much of a social media person, but Telegram had become her favorite app recently, thanks to the dozens of quirky niche groups she'd stumbled upon. There were groups for art lovers, book enthusiasts, nature photographers, you name it. Mona loved them all, though her favorite was a small group called Alam Nagar Chronicles. The group wasn't particularly active, just a handful of locals sharing stories, old photos, and the occasional funny meme. But something about it felt special, like a little slice of the town's soul preserved in digital form. That morning, as she scrolled through the chat, she noticed a new message from an unfamiliar name, MMS Mona Alam. The message was simple, a link followed by the words, "Have you seen this?" Mona clicked on it without much thought, expecting some joke or poorly made meme. Instead, it opened a video. It was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old phone, and it showed the woods behind her house. The camera moved slowly, panning across the trees as if searching for something. Mona frowned. She recognized the path. It was one she took often on her walks. The video was oddly silent, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the faint rustling of branches. Before she could finish watching, Rehan burst into her room, startling her. "Mona, did you take my charger?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. "No," she replied, quickly closing the video. "It's probably where you left it. Check the living room." Rehan rolled his eyes but left without pressing further. Mona Mona sat back in her chair, staring at the now closed video. Something about it felt strange, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Shrugging it off, she bookmarked the link and promised herself she'd take a look later. For now, the day was too bright, too peaceful to dwell on something so trivial. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of normalcy. Mona helped her mother with chores, teased Rayhan about his phone addiction, and spent an hour sketching by the window. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she decided to take a walk. She loved this time of day, when the town seemed to slow down even further, the streets quieter, the air cooler. Slipping on her shoes, she headed for the woods, her favorite spot to think and unwind. The path was as familiar as her own reflection, lined with tall trees that cast long shadows across the ground. The evening air was filled with the soft chirping of birds and the distant rustle of leaves. She walked slowly, savoring the tranquility, her thoughts drifting back to the video from earlier. What had it been about? Who had sent it? She didn't know, and for some reason, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. As she reached a clearing, she stopped to sit on an old weathered log, watching as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. It was quiet, peaceful, just as it always was. But as she sat there, a faint feeling crept into her chest, something she couldn't quite name, a whisper of unease, perhaps, or simply the weight of unanswered questions. She shook her head, brushing the thought away. It was probably nothing. After all, what could possibly be out of the ordinary in a place like Alam Nagar? The woods remained silent, the trees standing tall and unmoving. The day had ended as quietly as it began. For now, as the soft light of dusk faded into the deep blues of evening, Mona lingered in the clearing, tracing patterns in the dirt with the toe of her shoe. The woods behind her house had always been a place of solace, a retreat from the hum of everyday life in Alam Nagar. Here, she felt she could think more clearly, her thoughts as open and sprawling as the canopy above her. Tonight, though, her thoughts kept circling back to that strange video. The woods looked exactly as they always had, tall, familiar trees, swaying gently in the cool breeze, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot when she shifted her weight. Yet the memory of the video tugged at her curiosity. It had been so ordinary, and yet something about it had felt slightly off, as though the person behind the camera had been looking for something, or perhaps someone. She glanced over her shoulder toward the trail that led back home. It was getting dark, and her mother would probably start calling her soon, wondering where she had wandered off to. Mona let out a small sigh and stood up, brushing stray bits of bark from her jeans. She told herself she'd walk just a little farther, maybe to the bend in the path where the old banyan tree stood, before heading back. The sound of her own footsteps was soothing as she walked, breaking the quiet rhythm of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, its cry echoing faintly before fading into silence. Mona's pace slowed as she reached the banyan tree, its gnarled roots stretching out like fingers across the forest floor. She placed a hand on the rough bark, feeling its cool texture under her palm. The tree had always fascinated her. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about it when she was little, tales of how it had stood for centuries, watching over the town and its people. Sometimes her grandmother would say it was just a tree, but other times, when the air was still and the moon was high, the tree was something more, a keeper of secrets. Mona shook her head, smiling to herself. She had always loved those stories, even though she knew they were just that, stories. Her grandmother had a way of making even the simplest things feel magical. But now, standing here alone with the last traces of daylight slipping away, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of that same wonder, a small part of her wanting to believe. As she turned to head back, her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her in the stillness. She pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a message from Rihan. "Where are you? Mom's calling. Dinner's ready." Mona smiled, her brother's impatience almost palpable even through a text. She quickly typed back a reply, "Coming, don't eat everything," and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The woods were darker now, the path ahead faintly visible in the dim light. She quickened her pace, the thought of warm food and lively conversation pulling her forward. The house was aglow with warm yellow light when she finally stepped out of the woods. Rinku barked from the front yard, wagging his tail excitedly as he ran toward her. Mona knelt to ruffle his fur, laughing softly as he licked her hand. Inside, the dining table was already set, the aroma of spiced curry and freshly baked bread filling the air. Rayhan was leaning against the fridge, scrolling through his phone, while their mother placed the last dish on the table. The room felt alive with the comforting chaos of home. Clattering plates, soft laughter, the hum of the ceiling fan. As they sat down to eat, Mona found herself stealing glances at Rayhan, wondering if he'd seen anything about the video on Telegram. She debated asking him, but decided against it for now. The evening was too pleasant, too full of the simple joys of family to bring up something so trivial. Instead, she joined in on their usual dinner-time banter, laughing as Rayhan complained about a boring school project, and their mother teased him about needing to work harder. Later, as she helped clear the table, her thoughts drifted back to the woods, to the banyan tree, and to the video she hadn't yet finished. She told herself it could wait. There was no rush, no reason to dwell on it, but as she climbed into bed that night, pulling the blanket up to her chin, a tiny flicker of curiosity remained. It wasn't unease exactly, just a faint, persistent wonder about who had sent her that link and why. The house grew quiet around her, the soft hum of crickets outside lulling her toward sleep. The phone on her bedside table buzzed again, a single notification lighting up the screen. Mona turned over, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and decided she'd check it in the morning. It could wait. Everything could wait. And yet, as her breathing slowed and sleep began to take hold, the woods outside stood silent, unmoving. The banyan tree stood tall, its roots twisting deep into the earth, and somewhere in the vast network of digital connections she so loved to explore, someone, somewhere, was waiting. The next morning arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that made the world outside feel hushed and distant. Mona stirred under the covers, the faint patter of rain against her window, pulling her from the edges of a dream she couldn't quite remember. For a moment, she stayed there, cocooned in the warmth of her bed, the memories of the previous day lingering in her mind like faint whispers. Her phone, still resting on the bedside table, buzzed softly. The notification from the night before was still there, unread. Mona reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cool screen as she swiped it open. It was another message from the same Telegram group, this time from a different sender. "Did you watch it yet?" Her brows furrowed. She hadn't mentioned the video to anyone in the group, let alone replied to the original message. Yet, here it was, someone seemingly waiting for her reaction. She glanced at the timestamp. It had been sent in the early hours of the morning, long after she had gone to sleep. Something about the message felt odd, though she couldn't explain why. Brushing off the unease, Mona got up and went about her morning routine. The house was unusually quiet. Her mother had gone to the market, and Rayhan was still fast asleep. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and the rain had reduced to a soft drizzle, leaving the world outside painted in muted shades of green and gray. She made herself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward in delicate tendrils, and sat by the window. The woods behind the house were shrouded in mist, their edges blurred as if they were part of some distant dream. Mona stared at them as she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting back to the video. She hadn't gone back to it since the previous day, but the memory of that grainy footage lingered in her mind, like an unfinished sentence. The faint sound of a notification broke her trance. Her phone lit up again, another message from the group. "You'll want to see the end." A chill crept up her spine, though the words themselves weren't threatening. There was something unsettling about their precision, as though whoever had sent them knew exactly how to pique her curiosity. Against her better judgment, Mona opened the video again, her tea forgotten on the windowsill. The footage was just as she remembered, silent and mundane, the camera panning across the woods behind her house. But this time, she noticed something she hadn't before. In the corner of the frame, near the base of the banyan tree, there was a faint outline of something or someone. The figure was barely visible, half obscured by the shadows of the tree's roots, but it was there, unmoving. Her breath hitched. She rewound the video, pausing at the exact moment the figure appeared. It was blurry, impossible to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakably human. Mona leaned closer, her eyes scanning the screen for any clue as to who or what it could be. And then the video glitched. The screen flickered, the image distorting for a brief second before freezing entirely. When it resumed, the camera was no longer focused on the banyan tree. Instead, it was pointed at something much closer. A hand, pale and still, resting against a tree trunk. The camera lingered there for a moment before panning upward, revealing a face. Mona's own face. She gasped, nearly dropping the phone. The screen went black, leaving her staring at her own reflection in the darkened glass. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in the silence of the room. She wanted to believe it was some kind of trick, an edited video meant to scare her. But she knew the woods, knew the banyan tree, knew the path the camera had taken, and she knew she had never been there with a camera. The phone buzzed again in her hand, startling her. Another message from the group. "It's closer than you think." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her eyes darted to the window, to the mist-shrouded woods beyond. They looked just as they always had. Quiet, serene, untouched. But now they felt different, as though they were watching her as much as she was watching them. The rain picked up again, tapping against the glass in a steady rhythm. Mona took a step back from the window, her mind racing. She didn't know who had sent the video or how they had captured her face. But one thing was certain. The answers weren't going to come from sitting inside. Her gaze drifted to the woods one last time, the banyan tree barely visible through the mist. The thought of going back there filled her with a mix of dread and unshakable curiosity. She didn't want to go, not really, but deep down she knew she would. The house creaked softly as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, and something else she couldn't quite place. Mona turned away from the window, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand, and began to prepare for what lay ahead. The woods were waiting, and so, it seemed, was something else.